one, 1 hour. We want to make sure we make the best use of it. So good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in what we hope will be a stimulating discussion. I'll quickly take you through the logistics and the structure of the meeting. But before I do that, could I please invite a moment of silence to honor the victims of the latest attacks on a maternity hospital in Kabul, in a funeral in the eastern province of Afghanistan that took the lives of so many people, including newly born babies and mothers. So please join me. Thank you. May this endless, senseless war come to an end. In terms of the structure of the meeting, my colleague Nadia Rahman will introduce the host and moderator and our panelists, and then we'll hand it over to our distinguished moderator, Professor Bhabha, to lead the discussion, which will go for about 40 minutes. We'll have 10 minutes for Q&A with the audience after. Please use the virtual hand sign. If you have a question, you can also use the chat room, and my colleagues will help summarize for Professor Bhabha, who will also wrap up the meeting with some key discussion points from today. And then at the very end, my colleague Saif and a couple of our students from Pakistan and India will end the meeting with a call to action. Thank you very much. And with that, I hand it over to my colleague Nadia Rahman. Nadia, you're muted.
Right. Good morning, and to people in Cambridge, and good evening to our guests joining us from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. Very welcome to you all on behalf of South Asia Engagement Group at Harvard Kennedy School and the Benazir Bhutto Leadership Program. South Asia Engagement Group is a student body at Harvard Kennedy, and it works to encourage dialogue and cooperation amongst students and countries in South Asia. And the Benazir Bhutto Leadership Program is a Class Act 73 program. It is was launched by the Harvard class of 73, and it works on promoting peace and democracy and human rights through relationship building and fellowships. And with this, I would like to introduce our distinguished moderator, Professor Jacqueline Bhabha. We are honored to have you with us. And Professor Jacqueline Bhabha is a professor of health and human rights at Harvard Chen School of Public Health. She's also the Jeremiah Smith Lecturer at the Law School. She has extensive experience on human rights in South Asia and Roma communities, and serves on the board of Scholars at Risk Network and the World Peace Foundation, and also the General of Refugee Studies. From Bangladesh, we have, from Afghanistan, we're honored to have Shahrazad Akbar, the chairwoman of the Independent Afghanistan Board of Human Rights Commission. She has served as a senior advisor to the president of Afghanistan and has worked on advancing Afghan civil society for peace building, tolerance, and human rights. We are also joined with Kedar. He is the CEO and the managing director of Unilever in Bangladesh, and he's working with the government of Bangladesh on to prevent the contagion and spread of the pandemic with the WASH campaign. And from India, we're joined with Salil Shetty. Salil Shetty is a long-term activist and a champion of cooperation in the Global South. He has served as the Secretary General of Amnesty International for a decade, and during his time, Amnesty International, under his leadership, they achieved several breakthroughs, including the Global Arms Trade Treaty in 2013. And they also made significant progress on capital punishment, on outlawing capital punishment. Finally, from Pakistan, it's my pleasure to introduce Shakil Durrani. Shakil Durrani has served as a senior civil servant in Pakistan. He has served as a chief secretary in provinces that border with conflict zones. He has served as the chief secretary of Pakistan-held Kashmir, and also Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the adjoining tribal areas of Pakistan which border Afghanistan. He has also served. He has been given the title of Father of Kalash by the Kalash community itself for stopping the forced conversion to Islam of this minority community during the era of Zia. So how he stood up to a military dictator, how a civil servant stands up to a military dictator is something that we have to learn from him. So with this, I would pass this over to Professor Jacqueline Bhabha to start the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Khyber. Thank you to all of you for organizing this, this meeting. I think at a time when we're all isolated, dialogues like this are really critical, both for keeping us connected, keeping us thinking, but also keeping us positive about the scope for engagement. So I really commend you for putting together this excellent panel. So as we've just been told, we have 4 excellent speakers really covering major countries in South Asia. We're going to hear from each of them, and the order of business is that each speaker is going to speak for not more than 10 minutes, please. I'm then going to ask 1 question and then move on to the next speaker. So we'll deal with all 4 speakers in that way. We'll then have a brief discussion if we have time amongst the panel, and then hopefully we will open it up for Q&A from the audience for the remaining time with a punctual ending at 1 o'clock. So 1 o'clock East Coast time. So that's the plan. I think by now many of you will be familiar with Zoom. So please feel free to send your comments by chat. And to raise questions, raise issues. People are going to be monitoring them, and we really welcome an interactive engagement with the conversation. So let me first introduce Shahrazad Akbar. As we've heard, the chairwoman of the Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan, and as Khyber rightly said, this is, as so often, a very, very dark moment in Afghan history. And so I think we're privileged to hear from a leader who has thought deeply about human rights issues. So Shahrazad, over to you.
Thank you. I'm so honored and privileged to be on this panel and to be speaking to all of you. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak about Afghanistan and the human rights situation in Afghanistan at this critical time. And in terms of specifically how the Afghan government is managing the COVID-19 response and what are some human rights dimensions of the issue here in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was one of the countries, as you might know, that started implementing the lockdown in some of its major cities pretty early. And while considering the very fragile health infrastructure here, that was a decision that was probably necessary. It has had, of course, implications for people's access to their social and economic rights. It has made particularly the daily wage earners and other people who depend on getting out on a daily basis. Their livelihoods depend on it. It has made it them very vulnerable. There is a real fear and risk of starvation impacting the population. So from that aspect, specifically the Commission and our colleagues, we have been looking at how lockdown is impacting the most vulnerable economically, and how the distribution of aid by the government considers the principles of non-discrimination, fairness, and transparency, because there is a huge gap of trust between the public and the government, and unfortunately a culture of corruption that's rampant. So there is a lot of fear and anxiety about misuse. Last week or earlier this week, I have gotten my days mixed up with all the terrible events here, but there was a protest in one of the Afghan province, one of the poorest Afghan provinces, or the protest was by the local people because they feared about not being on a distribution list for some aid by some Qatari organization. The people got impatient and threw stones at the police. We had several civilian casualties. There was exchange of fire. In a context like Afghanistan, of course, the government immediately claimed that among the protesters, there were armed men, something that we could verify, but eyewitnesses also spoke about the fact that there were in fact, no armed men among the protesters. It's just a small example of the multiple layers of challenges, human rights challenges that we face in the COVID-19 situation. The prospects of starvation, anger has made people very understandably very desperate. Aid is very hard to to reach people. Government is overly centralized and bureaucratic. The process takes very, very long time. And there are issues of corruption. And the police are also under immense pressure to implement lockdown measures, which leads to really tense encounters and to serious violations of human rights by the government. Another aspect, of course, has been of the COVID-19 response and the COVID-19 situation that's relevant to the rights is the issue of women and women having to be home with their abusers. It's a global issue, as you all know. In Afghanistan, it's complicated by the fact that many organizations like ours would generally just take in-person referrals. And in the absence of in-person referrals, by the time organizations move around and kind of set up hotlines or other means of registering complaints and following up complaints, checking in with victims of abuse, and also for women to make these phone calls safely from home while they're constantly being watched by other family members. This has created a specifically concerning situation for us as the Human Rights Commission. The other aspect has been the rights of detainees and prisoners. Afghan prisoners are all overcrowded. Under normal circumstances, they are overcrowded and they are not. They cannot uphold the necessary measures for humane treatment of all detainees because of lack of space, being a major issue. In this COVID-19 situation, very early on, as soon as the first case was established, the Commission started advocating for a variety of measures, including temporary releases. Thankfully, the government has gone ahead and there have now been 2 presidential decrees for release of prisoners. However, the process of release, again, because of the bureaucracy, is very, very slow, is not satisfactory. So we had to today again make a statement about this issue because we have now several positive cases in several places of detention in Afghanistan, and we are hugely concerned, especially for female prisoners who are there with their children in most cases. And we are just very worried about the spread in the place of detention, and closely monitoring that and constantly pushing the government to take measures to respond more quickly and to enable prisoners to have access to health services that they may require, prisoners and detainees. There's, of course, the other dimension with the peace process here. As you know, Afghanistan is supposed to be starting Afghan negotiations any day now, although the recent violence has meant that the government has gone out and said that we have moved from a defensive position to an offensive, meaning that the violence will most likely, unfortunately, be escalated. However, US is trying very hard and other international partners to start intra-Afghan negotiations. There were a lot of worries about transparency when the US-Taliban talks were going on. There was very little access to the venue for journalists, for right activists, but at least people had the possibility of organizing conferences, consultations, feedback, forums, protests. However, due to COVID-19, none of that would be possible, and at least in near future. So we're very concerned about the issues around transparency and public engagement with the peace process, and trying to be ourselves very proactive and creative. So we have started a social media campaign, not campaign, but a social media initiative where every day we put a video of a victim from one part of Afghanistan, men and women from different parts of Afghanistan, to speak about their stories, because we really want the voices and stories of victims to be at the center of this peace process if we want to move ahead to a lasting peace. We have also put together a proposal with 4 specific mechanisms about how to include victims in the process, also considering some of the COVID-19 limitations, and have shared it with all stakeholders, including Taliban, hoping that we can encourage them to consider this so that the process does not become a very secretive, very distant, very elite-centered, very politicized discussion that's really detached from the Afghan public and the Afghan civil society. And so these are some of the issues that I want to raise. I'm, of course, very happy to respond to any questions.
Shahrazad, thank you. That was a really magnificent, concise, substantive, and very informative presentation. I just have really one general reflection and then a question or two. So the reflection is that I think you outlined so well how a pandemic really acts like a magnifying glass for previous issues. So you raised the issues of starvation, issues of domestic violence, issues of transparency, corruption, centralization. These are all, of course, pre-existing problems with many countries. But the emergency, in a way, exacerbates these tendencies. It shines a clearer light on them. And so I think we have both an enhanced problem, but also an enhanced opportunity, because many of the issues that are hidden are suddenly laid bare at a time of enormous public engagement and public concerns. So that's an opportunity, and I think people in your role, I'm sure, are very aware of that and are using that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you said about domestic violence. I know that in some countries there have been schemes to try to make it possible for women primarily who are trapped with their abusers to communicate to the outside the danger that they're in. So in France, I think there was a kind of a scheme which had a particular phone number and a particular number that people could cite. A colleague, a student of mine working in India, mentioned this red bindi scheme. So you have a red dot, like a bindi on your palm, and you show it. So I just wondered whether in Afghanistan there's been anything like this, and what you're doing to kind of reach out to, an extremely vulnerable trapped population. One could also add, of course, children, because not only are children likely to be exposed to enormous amounts of, intimate partner violence perpetrated on parents, but they themselves are going to be, as usual, at the kind of receiving end of the stress that families are going through. So that's one question. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. The other question relates to something you didn't mention, but is very kind of a real interest of mine, which is the question of migrants. So we've read that very large numbers of Afghan refugees from Iran have returned, including quite significant numbers of children, including unaccompanied children. And of course, they're returning from a situation which was already complicated and compromised into a situation which is full of uncertainty. And of course, they're coming from a country which had one of the most severe outbreaks. we've heard in other contexts of the stigma and the hostility meted out on migrant populations who are seen as being contaminators, you know, coming from a more dangerous place to probably a safer place, you know, and probably Iran is a more dangerous place from the COVID perspective than Afghanistan. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit about migrants in answering my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those really thoughtful questions, and also the comment you made about the opportunity. Absolutely. I think one thing that we are noticing and realizing is just the general public generosity, and the fact that there are so many traditional ways of giving and supporting and extending support that we usually don't remember or don't acknowledge, but they have all been activated in face of government's slow response, especially when combating poverty. And we are also hoping that the discussions that have been created about that discussions that have come more to fore about both issues of equality, but also issues of gender and issues of related to places of detention and the rights of detainees, that they would be they would be windows for us to advocate for better for better access to rights on all different spheres. Considering this the lessons that we learned from this COVID-19 situation. On your specific questions on domestic abuse, we have put out phone numbers for our colleagues in different offices. As I said before, we were very ill-equipped to deal with a situation like this, because we would usually because we have to, once we register a complaint, we have to process it with the Afghan legal system, and that usually requires signatures and other forms of in-person presence. But we try to rearrange and reorganize our own work to be able to take in complaints and follow them up through phone calls. And we are looking now, right now, we are experimenting to see how adequate that response is, to what extent can we capture at least some of the problems that exist there, and try to find solutions for them, refer people to shelters, if you refer people to counselors, and look at if there's need for legal follow-up. But it's not going to be sufficient really in the face of the problem that we are facing. So we have to continuously try to explore other ways of reaching out, look at other examples of what might be possible. It's a huge area of concern for me also, because shelters, which there aren't many of in Afghanistan, there are very few shelters and safe houses for women. Many of them have now stopped taking in victims of domestic abuse because they don't want to be overpopulated. So it's a particular crisis in the making, unfortunately. And similarly with the children, we don't know the full extent of the problem. What we know is more anecdotal, because we had been referring mostly to the in-person referrals in many of the provinces that we work in. But as data starts coming in, I think we need to push many more organizations to step in, including a women's ministry here in Afghanistan to provide support. In terms of migrants, one of the biggest, there are a whole host of issues, of course, of reintegration, huge numbers coming back in, government being unable to provide services in a normal situation, in normal circumstances, from access to school and healthcare and employment. But right now, you're feeling even more pressured when these people go to their host communities and provinces. There was a lot of problem of the inability to do proper testing and screening at the border, because the numbers were so great. You know, we had days when more than 10,000 people would come in. It was just humanly impossible. The infrastructure wasn't there to do testing of all these people who were coming in, to even do a basic temperature test at that time. And then containing people in Herat is not possible. Herat is the border town with Iran, so people had to, border province, so people were sent to their communities, which meant that some people went to some of the poorest provinces and took, and of course, then took the illness there, and then there were very few services there to be provided. Initially, there was there was some attempt and planning around trying to contain it by testing people in Herat, and there's a little better healthcare infrastructure, diverting resources there and trying to help people recover there and spend some time there and provide them with some basic needs, but that didn't go as planned. And then there's, of course, issues of stigma, as you mentioned as well. So there is something that's something that we have noticed already, that people who are returnees from Iran face a lot of stigma, even in the communities, especially in communities and in cities where there is small populations of people who have ever returned from Iran or have had interactions. When they go to villages or small towns, they stand out immediately. People call the police. People inform the Ministry of Public Health officials. People don't interact with these families. So issue of stigma has become, unfortunately, something that we have witnessed in several places.
Thank you so much. We could talk at length, but these are really helpful remarks. So thank you. So I'm now going to call on our second speaker, Kedar Lele from Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mrs. Bhabha. I realize I'm the odd man out here. I represent business, of course, and I currently work in Bangladesh for the last few years. Maybe a couple of minutes I should take for the benefit of everyone to give a bit of a background on Bangladesh, and I think you would love that, because in 1971, Henry Kissinger used to call this country a basket case of an economy, a destination of world aid, NGOs, and people wanting to basically help a large number of population get out of the God-created issues that they were struggling with. Call it famine, call it liberation war, post effect of that war, maybe floods in 74, and so on and so forth. From there on, this country has proven that there is an immense sense of resilience, great transformation, and government and public-private partnership to drive Human Development Index. And the kind of efforts that I've seen in this country have left me wondering that why isn't it possible for other democratic countries in D&E or developing and emerging part of the world to have a consistent economic growth which leads to social standards also improving. Bangladesh has been a case of pulling out millions of people out of poverty, and of course reaching a very respectable level in the per capita income, as well as the indicators like maternal and child health, which were delivered through the MDG goals which were achieved. Now, suffice it to say that this is one of the few countries in the world where from Prime Minister's office, a regular monitoring is done on how countries doing on SDG goals as well. Now, I would keep the next few minutes about the COVID conversation because that's the focus of our discussions today. And I do believe that the COVID crisis has managed to do an equitable distribution of fear while unequitable distribution of consequences. And this is one crisis which has impacted all of us to the same extent, but a large number of people in this country, close to 80% of workers actually work in informal economy, which means they are daily wage earners without any social security, without any health insurance, or devoid of even minimum wages. And to those, the aftermath of COVID-19 will be very, very severe. So what has happened since the mid-March when the crisis started hitting everyone in the world? Unpredictable disruption of daily life. And of course, in democracy, all of us can complain about what government does. But the fact is, government in Bangladesh decided to call it general holiday instead of a lockdown. In a country of 165 million people, imagine what the term general holiday will do. A large number of people thought it was a holiday announced by government, and they decided to go back to their hometowns and villages, and thousands of people were crowding the boats and the public transport, and we had a problem on our hands. After that, there's of course a severe impact on livelihood. And in the choice between the lives and livelihood, the governments have to first protect the lives and then comes the livelihood. But But look at this, and I said before that when 80% of workers in Bangladesh are in informal jobs, the impact of losing that employment can be felt within the week, right? People who are rickshaw pullers, people who are working in the villages, or people who are working in the famed ready-made garments sector, and I'm sure most of you are wearing t-shirts or garments which are part of them are made in Bangladesh. Now with exports getting shifted out or orders getting cancelled, we have more than 4 million workers actually at the danger of not having a job. Forget about a job for a few months, not even getting their bonuses for their most important festival of the year that's going to come in a week's time. Now with this, I suspect and I'm concerned that years of hard work will get nullified in this year. There is a research which suggests that a large number of people who are pulled out of poverty will actually become part of new poor in the country. And those are significant issues that government will have to tackle. Now, of course, jury is still out on which government did the right thing when the crisis hit them. It ranges from Canada to, of course, New Zealand. And there are conversations that I've seen saying, look at how New Zealand has managed it well. Pardon me for saying this, but in Bangladesh, one colony might have more people than what New Zealand has as population. New Zealand doesn't have a problem of infrastructure or healthcare investments or social distancing. For God's sake, these are extremely high level of facilities which people in Bangladesh would deserve to have, because on an average, Bangladesh government has spent just about 4.5% of its GDP allocation into healthcare creation. So urgent big priorities, in my opinion, are of course, today Pakistan has a system, India has a system that we call as public distribution system for essentials and food items, and that system was taken out in Bangladesh a few years ago. And I think today government and people realize that ability to distribute essentials at affordable prices or maybe sometimes free to masses is a huge backbone in a democracy where you have large number of people who might fall off the ladder because of a crisis. I spoke about healthcare infrastructure, and I must say that we must congratulate those NGOs and large entities like BRAC or UNICEF and Friendship and some of the local NGOs who have rushed to the aid of the government as well as to people, setting up the testing centers, importing PPEs and providing the essential commodities and healthcare services to people of Bangladesh. As of now, a country is able to test close to 7,000 to 8,000 people every day. We have tested 150,000 people already in last 2 months, and the numbers are going to increase, of course. And maybe some of the suggestions that I might have as a business professional would be, government must invest in food for work program maybe. Infrastructure development must involve local labor in order to provide some employment. And of course, the usual impetus or the programs which have to be created for bringing a little more formalization in the employment and financial inclusion for these millions of people who we've got. I, of course, represent Unilever, and I love the organization because I've been with this company for a very, very long time for its purpose-driven, value-led business model, which is a multi-stakeholder business model. Maybe you can call it responsible capitalism that we have begun to talk about. And we have been working with partners, including government, and a number of them, number of those partners allowed us to reach out to people in need, and it started with a large number of people who are part of our own ecosystem. So we might have a couple of thousand employees, but we have more than 20,000 families and those people who work with us in our outer ecosystem. And we were one of the first organizations which said that we will not only protect their jobs and their incomes, but we'll also educate them about the social distancing, the discipline around behavior protocols, and so on and so forth. I can tell you that because the way we have been working as an organization, and this is the time of partnership, yeah, a company talks to government, government talks to other organizations, and slowly because all of us are learning by doing. Nobody had a playbook to manage this crisis. And in this manner, we've been able to tell them how to run organizations, manufacturing units, offices under current circumstances, because this is a long drawn battle. This won't get over in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe 6 months. We'll all have to start to learn to live with this, and hence partnerships and being able to work with one another is the need for of the hour. So with that, I'll conclude because I'm almost out of time, and maybe anything that you may want to ask me, Jacqueline.
Kedar, thank you very much, and welcome to our non-corporate world. We're delighted to have you as our person out. And I really appreciate the way you started with kind of really the remarkable success story of Bangladesh, which I think many of us are in awe of. Many of us who work in South Asia often use Bangladesh as the kind of, you know, as the success story on many, many issues, as you mentioned, including issues of gender, of girls' education and so on. It's remarkable for a country which has had choppy political leadership and a fair share, more than its fair share of climate disasters, to have seen this progress. So I'm very glad you made that point and rebutted the kind of basket case kind of stereotype. And I'm also very glad that you talked, I thought you put it very well, this kind of uniformity of fear and disuniformity or difference of impact is a very concise way of really pinpointing the way this pandemic is working everywhere. You know, it's really presenting a magnifying glass to inequities, pre-existing inequities, and exacerbating them. So some countries like the US, where I am at the moment, you know, we see the inequities of race writ large. Just to give you, for those of you who haven't seen it, a statistic, African Americans in the US are 13% of the global, of the American population, and they're 30% of those affected by COVID. So that just speaks volumes. But turning back to Bangladesh, I think you also made a couple of other very important points. One is the question of kind of collaboration between government and civil society. And of course, Bangladesh has been graced with the most amazing civil society organizations. You mentioned BRAC, which is a world leader, but there are many others. And this, of course, is a very important point, because as Shahrazad was also saying, this question of moving from very centralized governance to decentralization is a critical issue. So I wondered if you could, my first question to you really is, could you reflect a little bit more on how well you or badly you think government is doing, not in talking to people, but in listening? Because so much of the success of the response is going to be driven by local contextual information, which actually communities know about. Communities may not know the details, of course, of the COVID-19 virus, but they do understand a lot of issues about need and about the impact, disproportionate impact. So that's my one question to you is, how well do you think the government is doing in this critical job of listening to, you know, civil society organizations, local communities, very local kind of governance organizations? And my second question, but very briefly, because we don't have much time, is really about the informal economy. As you rightly said, you know, a very disproportionate majority of workers literally live hand to mouth and often face obstacles, not just from their own context, but also because of government regulations. So what opportunities for greater financial inclusion do you think COVID-19 is presenting?
Two very interesting questions, and let me try and answer the first one. The cornerstone of democracy was that people will get the government which they have chosen. It's government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, Bangladesh has the benefit of being a compact country, right? 148,000 square kilometer of landmass, and 64 districts, 85 cities, 85,000 villages. With that, their ability to listen to what's happening in the communities is much, much higher. I must agree, and rather I must say to this fact that I have not seen this level of preparedness in any country that I have visited in the DNE, developing and emerging part of the world, where the messages can be translated so quickly across the length and breadth of the country, right? Whether it is a natural calamity or a storm or a flood, they have the ability to save people by getting the messages out. However, under COVID, I have seen that the dynamism of this crisis has been of the order, and the lack of information has been so much that people have had the misfortune of getting government regulatory messages changing by the hour, sometimes by the day and sometimes by the hour. And that has caused immense amount of confusion on ground. And we have worked with district collectors, and we have realized that implementation of those rules have been difficult. So I'm giving you a different perspective, but the answer to that is no, the dialogue is not happening at the moment. Government is acting basis the information that they have from the official channels. On informal economy and the opportunity for financial inclusion, I think time has come for Bangladesh to realize that the 56 or 57 financial institutions and banks that they have are inadequate to drive the kind of financial inclusion that's expected. So formalization of that informal employment is possible by driving the confluence of technology, affordable mobile phones, and as they say, the technology access and financial inclusion could come together. And that's a great opportunity, in my opinion, which government is looking at under the A2I or IT-centric initiatives that they are taking. But it'll take time. COVID might accelerate it for sure. And that's the hope we all have.
Thank you so much, Kedar. That was really, really interesting. So I'm turning now to my friend and colleague, Salil Shetty from India. Salil, you're on, as they say. Nice to re-meet you.
Good to see you, Jackie. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And, I was reading Guterres's statement, the UN Secretary General's statement from a couple of weeks ago, where he said that, what started off as a health crisis has ended up becoming a human rights crisis. And it's not often that Guterres actually says something like this. So it must have taken a lot for him to come out publicly to say this, because normally it's the High Commissioner who makes these human rights kind of noises. So I mean, there is no question that, this has become a serious human rights situation. And of course, I was happy to see Aniko here. So friends like Orban and Duterte have taken it to, to kind of they've taken it to its logical conclusion, where they've essentially taken formal dictatorial powers, suspending the parliament and all of that. But we have our own share of these people in South Asia. South Asia has a very patchy record when it comes to human rights. We don't have that much to be proud of. Sri Lanka was the only country which had a decent record of some sort. Still, the Tamil genocide happened, and so now we are all equal in terms of human rights violations. So we have a very competitive situation across South Asia to figure out who is the worst set of human rights abusers. So of course, normally when we say human rights abuse, we refer to the state which is accountable for human rights abuses. But underlying that in South Asia is the fact that we have such a feudal, patriarchal, religious and casteist system underlying. So that kind of drives everything else, and I think I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, coming to India and COVID, all of the fault lines, which, as you mentioned in the US, Jackie, we have all the fault lines of the Islamophobia, the anti-Dalit, the anti-woman, all of that has been laid bare over the last month or so, and in different ways it's shown up. The fact is that the number of deaths that India has seen is very, very small compared to the population, and that death rate is very, very low. And of course, this is comparable to most developing countries. Now, in fact, India's death rate compared to the rest of South Asia is actually higher. But, as all governments do, suddenly the Indian government wants to compare ourselves with the richest countries in the world. So, suddenly we want to look at our death rate in comparison to the US and Europe, which is completely irrelevant. So we should be comparing with poor countries, and we're not doing particularly well. If you take Nigeria, Indonesia, etc., death rates are higher. So we have about 3,000 deaths and roughly, and about 80,000 cases. The cases are a bit meaningless because we're not testing. So that number could be anybody's guess. I mean, we can't test 1.3 billion people, obviously. So, and most are asymptomatic. So I would say that, on the COVID health side, the situation today is that we don't have many deaths, and like most developing countries, we're not doing too badly. We have a younger demographic. We have a very limited mobility in the population, and so all of these factors are helping us to keep the death rate low as of now. Most epidemiologists are predicting that there's going to be a second wave that might happen in July. Heaven save us if we really have anything close to what happened in the West, because like all developing countries, we don't have a primary health care system or a public health system to talk about. We've been investing less than 2% on our public health of GDP. And, that's coming home to roost now, because we are amongst the highest military spenders in the world. We're constantly competing with Pakistan, but we're not ready to spend on public health. And that's going to cost us a lot if it really hits us. So far, we have not been hit. So I would say that, what India is facing today is actually not so much of a health crisis, a public health crisis. What we're facing is a humanitarian crisis because of the economic impact of what has happened. I would say that's the biggest challenge we're facing, because even the COVID hospitals which have been set up, etc., so far are empty. There's nobody in those hospitals. So we kind of obviously prepared ourselves for the worst, and we haven't had, thank heavens, we don't have that worst case scenario. And geographically, it's very concentrated. About 80% of the cases are concentrated in about 3 or 4 big cities. So it's as of now, it's a problem which we could tackle, just logistically, because if it truly spreads across the country, then we are doomed. So now, what is the humanitarian crisis? I mean, I think you're all following it. We had, the most graphic scene was just 2 days ago when 15 migrant laborers actually went to sleep out of exhaustion on a railway track, and they were mowed over by a train. And so you had the bodies of these 15, some of the poorest people. And this is roughly 93% of India's labor is in the informal sector. And what is most visible in the television screens, etc., is because the middle class and the rich in this country have suddenly discovered that we have migrant labor. And they've discovered it partly because you have television cameras following these people who are walking thousands of kilometers, and partly because suddenly our maid servants and drivers are not coming to work. So the middle class and the rich are suddenly affected for the first time. This has been said time and again in the past. The 2011 census brought up the shocking change in India's demographic, the urban-rural shift, etc. But we ignored it at that time. So it's not just a matter of the fact that they have no food, they have no jobs, but we are seeing a serious assault on the dignity of these people as well, because they're the contractors and the factory owners, etc., are not paying them. But they are political orphans, because in the state where they're working, the state government, as you know, India is made up of, it's a union of states, but the state governments in the domicile area where they're living don't really care for them because they have no votes. And they also think that these people are carrying the virus, so they want to kind of send them off if they can. And the states where these people come from are normally thousands of kilometers away, and they would rather not have them anyway because they're going to come with the disease. So we are in a really terrible situation when it comes to these people. They're being pushed from pillar to post. And then, of course, on top of that, they have to deal with the police and everything that the police normally does. So according to the Center for the CMIE, which is the main source of data, we have 120 million people now unemployed. This has just happened in the space of 6 or 8 weeks. Now this, so the state response has been, because we don't have a public health system to talk about, the system response is let us lock the country down. Now we're in a very interesting situation. In the Western countries, the progressive population in these Western countries want lockdown. Now the progressives in developing countries are saying, hang on. And here, interestingly, we have an alliance between the progressives in the developing world and the business interests, who are both saying, this is no good for the economy, and we are saying this is horrible for the poorest people in the country. So we have a slightly different situation from what's happening in the US, where the most kind of rank right reactionaries are saying, we don't want a lockdown. So I would just draw your attention to that. It's a slight distinction. I guess the main point that you want me...
Unfortunately, just quickly get to your final point. Sorry, we're running out.
So the last point I wanted to make was, which is kind of, I think when people say, what is the human rights impact? I think they're talking about what is the civil and political rights impact. Now, obviously, we have a Hindu nationalist regime, which is made up of elected authoritarian government, which has been, which is essentially been slowly dismantling all our democratic institutions to start with. But now what has happened is they have launched the Epidemic Diseases Act and the Disaster Management Act. So Parliament is pretty much suspended. The judiciary hardly meets, only exceptional cases. We already had a pliant media, and now there's a systematic attack on any dissenting sections of the media. Those protesters who are fighting against the Citizenship Amendment Act, they're going after them under the guise of, right now we have this cover of COVID, so there is no legitimacy for anybody to raise questions right now because it's a public health emergency. We can't ask questions. So they're arresting people in Kashmir. The Public Safety Act has been extended against many of the leaders there. So essentially the labor laws have been diluted. Things which have been fought for decades in 3 states have been diluted. So Jackie, the list is long. I'm not going to go through every single thing which which is happening in the country. So I would say that we are in a very critical situation. The state response has been very, very weak. Yesterday there was a new announcement about what they're going to be doing to help migrant workers, etc. We're still trying to unscramble that. The civil society response has been huge in terms of relief, etc. But in terms of the democratic assault that we're seeing, there's no great kind of silver lining right now. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Salil. There's so much to be said, but an hour is optimistic for 4 great presentations. So thank you. I'm not going to ask you questions now. We'll see if we have any minutes left at the end. I'm going to move right on to our final panelist, Shakil Durrani from Pakistan. Shakil, please, can we hear your comments? Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon all. As far as the primary impact of COVID in Pakistan is concerned, so let me say, it has been huge, unfortunately, both in terms of the job losses, and there have been, maybe we've lost 6 to 7 million additional jobs. The unemployment ratio, which was high to begin with, 6.5%, might have doubled. Unfortunately, and most unfortunately, is the fact that those under the poverty line, which was said to be about 23%, might well have doubled. So these are facts which are going to impact upon Pakistan, and in the last year or two, our economy was under stress for a number of reasons. Our current account deficit was high. The investment ratio was not very comfortable. So, well, we have had quite an impact. This pandemic had an effect upon the Pakistan's economy. Now, the government initial figures are that the growth rate, the GDP growth rate, which was expected to be 3.3%, might fall to under 1.5. So all these things are going to impact in the next year or so. But let's see how long this pandemic lasts. It would appear, as has been stated before, that maybe the virus strain in Pakistan might be, and in India and in the region, might be slightly milder. And we are fortunate that the sort of impact it has on the lives in Europe and America, that's not happened. But, as far as the medium term and short term priorities are concerned on how to deal with it, because, it's the question of lives versus livelihood, very important. But what is most important is that we focus on lives at this stage. And very fortunately, we already had a vehicle in Pakistan for the last 10 or 11 years. It was called the SAES Benazir Income Support Program. That was there, well spread out. And it was therefore fortunate that because of this vehicle, the government was able to provide cash handouts amounting to about 140 billion rupees, which is just about $1 billion within a matter of weeks to 12 million people. So this was the high point. This was a great success, and we were fortunate that we already had this organization. The fact that the government is committing about $8 billion for different types of relief, that would help. Not forgetting that in Pakistan, the private philanthropy is almost 1.1% of our GDP, maybe slightly more than that, 240 billion rupees. That's the private philanthropy in Pakistan. And we've seen in this recent crisis that the people have been able to reach out, both especially in the urban areas, to those, the daily wage earners and those who have lost their jobs. So this was fortunate. And I might also mention that as far as this SAES Benazir Income Support Program is concerned, this focuses on the more vulnerable sections of the community, and that includes the minorities, the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Kalash, the women folk, those people who are most at risk. So that is fortunate. Time being short, I'm just sort of rushing through. As far as what does the future hold? As has been suggested, that some commentators suggest that the public health investment in public health in the years ahead might do what the IT revolution did in the past 2 decades. And I couldn't agree more. As long as we have a wider definition of public health, and it's just not confined to ensuring that we deal with the preventive diseases, diseases which could be prevented, like malaria and dengue fever and cholera and typhoid. We'll have to sort of expand the definition. We have not been doing too well in the last couple of years as far as polio is concerned. There has been a re-emergence, and we'll have to be very careful of that. But public health would also include the provision of piped drinking water and sanitation, because well over 60% of all diseases are waterborne, and we'll have to focus on these things very, very carefully. We'd also have to do something about the very high infant mortality ratio. Even if it's 64 to 1,000, it's far too high. You can't accept that. The maternal mortality ratio is much higher. In fact, we are amongst the at the bottom of the world. And we'd have to do better than that. We'll have to focus more in the years ahead as part of the public health program on child spacing, the family planning. 1.8% growth is just not tenable. That adds 5 million people to our population. And the fact that already 45% of the children are stunted, their growth is stunted. So you just have to do much more as far as public health is concerned. The government has a plan to build housing. Now that will be a good way of providing employment also. And if you have decent housing, it's going to affect the lives and the livelihoods and the health of the people over there. That's high priority. Afforestation is another area, and work for food, as someone suggested. So all these things are really important. The next month or so is going to be crucial, and we'll have to see how, what direction that pandemic takes, and that the government would have to focus on that along with that of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for my poor timekeeping. It's been a fascinating discussion. We have really ranged very broadly over positive opportunities for inclusion, positive opportunities for putting public health at the center of the agenda, for really increasing public-private kind of collaboration, but also the very real concerns about exploitation or manipulation of this moment of crisis to advance authoritarian agendas. So I think we've really done a good job in a very short space of time. What I would say is that I'd encourage our audience to please send questions and hope that the organizers will forward them to the panelists, because we don't have time now, which I regret. But really thank you all. And with that, I'm going to hand over back to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhabha. So it's a fantastic discussion. I think what's highlighted is the need for more partnerships between the private sector, public sector, experts coming together to address this challenge. And I think there is also a need for innovations to happen. Very interesting case of people 3D printing ventilator splitters, so that one ventilator can support multiple patients, printing face masks. So many small innovations, I think, has to also come as part of this response. I want to give a little bit space to our friend Malini to speak about community-led responses.
Hi, thank you so much everyone for joining us today. I think this is the first part of a longer conversation that we'll all have with ourselves and each other. So me and two of my team members, Afia and Samarth, who are also here, we have started an ethical organization called Milan Global. And Milan means solidarity, collaboration, coming together. And so you saw the diversity of speakers on the panel. Afia, me, and Samarth were an activist, educator, business person. So it's a very mixed crowd. And we really believe in the power of young people being unique, being creative, and using that creativity and uniqueness for shared visions to happen. So with COVID specifically, rather than each of us being involved in a COVID relief, we have been building a workforce of 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds who are all involved in multiple aspects of COVID relief in India and across the world, whether that's research focused or that's storytelling, etc. So what I would really say is the call to action is to genuinely invest in young people, because this is the world that today, what the choices we make is to destroy the world for them, right? So this is the world they are going to walk into one day because of choices we made today that we didn't have to make alone. And so even though we always talk about grassroots movement, that's not a reality, right? The people talking about grassroots movements are generally the people most detached from the grassroots level, which is why we make sure that our movement focuses on students and entrepreneurship specifically, which is giving students the economic autonomy that they deserve. And I feel this will resonate with many people, as Kedar said, like a lot of things with Unilever, etc. Their initiatives are really focused on the fact that when people have the power to just make their own choices, the face of a country, of a world really changes. And when those are young people and those barriers of identities are removed, we really believe that COVID has given us an opportunity to indiscriminately work to address these issues, because everyone is being affected, everyone is in that position. So thank you. You can check us out at milanglobal.in, and we are just very focused on our youth, our model young professionals, and you can find out more about that if you're interested. But I would say find a way to get involved and to look to the youth in your life and ask how can they start being a part of the change, because they know way more than we give them credit for.
Thanks, Malini. Vandinika, do you want to come in quickly? 30 seconds maybe?
Yes, thank you so much. I'll be very fast. Thank you for this panel and the insights. I've been helping lead an initiative called Frontliners First in India, which provides free mental health services to the first responders, nurses, doctors across hospitals, starting out in Delhi, and also police force, and just ensuring that as they are taking care of all of us, they have resources for their health and well-being, so that this is a sustainable fight. And ensuring that that part is also taken care of to be more future-minded. And so a call to action, we're looking for volunteers, support, communications. And I think with Malini, this is perfect connection to draw on some of those young volunteers, technologists, so that we can make sure every first responder has access to mental health, mindfulness, and health resources themselves as they give that to us.
Thanks, Vandinika. Asmer, do you want to quickly come in?
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Asmer Safi. I'm a sophomore at Harvard from Lahore, Pakistan. And essentially what me and a few friends of mine are doing are we trying to establish a student US-led coalition, a US student-led coalition for Pakistan, particularly with regards to fundraising opportunities, as well as connecting potential donors in the US, potential investors, potential companies, as well as people from the diaspora communities of Pakistan in the US to fundraising opportunities, particularly directed towards, as Durrani Saab mentioned, minority groups, remote areas, communities that otherwise the government might not have the most access to. And we're giving you a number of fundraising channels to potentially donate to, whether that's 501c3 organizations, they are government-led organizations, or independent fundraising opportunities within different remote areas of Pakistan. So if anyone's interested, I'll be dropping my email in the chat, and we can definitely hook you up with some of those organizations. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. And we're sorry we are a little over time. It was an excellent discussion, I think. Thank you, Professor Bhabha, our excellent panelists, and their audience. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, and we will, basically our students will be taking this content and repurposing it on our platforms for as many young people to hear what has been spoken about today. And don't be surprised if they try to engage with all of the people who spoke today and reach out to you and kind of find out more, because these are young people who will change the world as long as we give them that opportunity. So thank you so much.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Right.
I'd like to
Bye.
thank SAEG and also BPLP for hosting this and allowing us an opportunity to meet and talk about issues of cooperation despite conflict in South Asia. Thank you so much. Thank you.